Hi, everybody. I'm Brad Kelly. I'm the regional coordinator for the Society of Biblical Literature's Pacific Coast region, and happy to welcome you to this installment of this year's SBL Pacific Coast Regional Meeting that we're calling K-Ray and Kati, Read and Written. Things are different a little bit this year because of the pandemic, so some of our papers are coming to you as video recordings, and I'm excited to have a paper today by Dr. Jennifer Matheny from Nazarene Theological Seminary. This is a paper that comes from our program unit at the regional meeting called Emerging Critical Theory and Perspectives. And so the format will be the paper will go for 20 minutes. And then at the end of that, the chairperson of that program unit, Dr. Kay Higuera-Smith, will come on and interact for a little bit with our presenter to wrap things up. So without further delay, let me go ahead and turn it over to Jennifer Matheny. The title of her paper is A Grotesque Presentation, the Use of Women's Bodies in Judges 19 to 21. Jenny, please.
Thank you. All right, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen as we get started. All right, can everyone see that? Okay, excellent. The violence depicted with and to women's bodies in Judges 19 through 21 is excessive. It is exaggerated. It is extravagant. Julia O'Brien, in discussing insights with feminist film theory, shares the strong and evocative emotions that portraits of excess have on an audience. Using the work of Linda Williams, O'Brien discusses how body genres use female characters and how they can evoke bodily states and depict states of bodily excess. She lists the excess that we are familiar with in film. Pornography depicts the body in an excess state of orgasm. Melodrama depicts the body in an excess state of weeping. And horror film depicts the body in an excess state of terror. Similar to a horror film, these final 3 chapters in Judges place the reader in excess state of terror, and without much resolve at the end. It ends without finalization, open-ended. Grotesque realism is a useful lens for reading the excessive literary gendered violence. This horror story with women's bodies creates this excessive state of terror for the reader. It can produce somatic and psychological responses. Many scholars have casually used the word grotesque to describe Judges 19 through 21. Even though their use of it is more an observation of horror, a closer look at the grotesque, especially in conversation with Mikhail Bakhtin's grotesque realism, may produce some helpful insights into the portrait of excessive violence painted in these final 3 chapters. Reading as a woman, as a human, these chapters are difficult texts. Even though these are women's bodies in literature, they are still women's bodies. The silence adds to the horror. Every woman in these chapters is silent. Is there a counter voice to this portrait of horror? I will spend the bulk of this presentation looking at the grotesque portrait of the body of the Pilagesh through the lens of grotesque realism. Also stepping back at the function of degradation of Judges 19 through 21 as a whole, and then briefly at the end, if time, offer methodological possibilities that may contribute to a responsive answerability, intertextual voices of subversion and protest due to the nature of the genre of Judges 19 through 21. So I had proposed in a previous article that the genre of Judges 19 through 21 is a dialogic mashal, a proverb parable, due to the oddities in these 3 chapters, demonstrated by its characteristics. It's the longest cohesive narrative in Judges, contains nameless characters. It includes a strange great oath and great weeping, culminating in a strange epilogue ending of gendered violence and silence. So I've listed here some of the reasons that I give for this proposal, and also some examples of parables that don't have the intrinsic label of a mashal, similar to Judges 19 through 21, some that you might be familiar with. The reason this genre is worth considering and mentioning is that the nature of a mashal, a proverb parable, invites a readerly response. Coupled with the anticipatory function of the mashal, the reader and even other texts in the canon can offer voices of subversion and protest, especially in chapters of gendered violence and gendered silence, through interbiblical intertextuality, so those within the canonical corpus of the Hebrew Bible, and post-biblical intertextuality, those outside the Hebrew Bible. The reader is invited to ponder this graphic depiction and to offer a response to the horror. But my goal today is to illuminate the grotesque use of women's bodies. So right now, I'll just briefly recap the story. Feel free to pause the video if you like to reread Judges 19 through 21 as a refresher, but parental advisory warning, of course, this is a very dark story. So a few key points. Some of the main figures, we have a Levite and a Pelegesh. She is raped, a tragedy of grotesque proportions, and later the dismemberment of the woman by the Levite. The limbs of the woman are then sent as a message for the tribes to assemble. A great oath is taken, a grotesque oath, if I may, and this will climax as harem, the ban, is executed, not in accordance with covenant, but in accordance to this strange, regrettable oath. In chapter 20, there are burnt offerings and fellowship offerings made, and even fasting. Some commentators view these as proper rituals, but my reading is one of irony intensified. This is the first time fasting occurs in the book of Judges. This oath is great, yet also quite mysterious. An oath incited by a sketchy situation and an even sketchier call to assembly. One of the progenitive problems at the end of this story is that they made an oath not to give their women to the men of Benjamin. Even after executing the ban on Jabesh Gilead and seizing their women, they are still short. Still not enough women to repopulate the tribe. The dark irony grows through the story. They turn next to kidnap the women at Shiloh. Again, without much moral assessment by the narrator, as readers, we are invited into this parable to contemplate the grotesque. Grotesque realism can be an artistic depiction of excessive violence within its system of degradation, evoking a strange horror with its interplay of death and life. Degradation for Bakhtin is the essential principle of grotesque realism. Degradation here means coming down to the earth, the contact with the earth as an element that swallows up and gives birth at the same time. To degrade is to bury, to sow, and to kill simultaneously in order to bring forth something new, more, and better. To degrade also means to concern oneself with the lower stratum of the body, the life of the belly, and the reproductive organs. It therefore relates to acts of defecation and copulation, conception, pregnancy, and birth. Degradation digs a bodily grave for a new birth. It is not only a destructive negative aspect, but also a regenerating one. To degrade an object does not imply merely hurling it into the void of non-existence, into absolute destruction, but to hurl it down to the reproductive lower stratum, the zone in which conception and a new birth take place. Grotesque realism knows no other level. It is the fruitful earth and womb. It is always conceiving. Fiona Black traces the origin of the term grotesque to the Renaissance period where it's referred to a style of art that playfully incorporates animal and human bodies into various decorative designs. It was applied to frescoes of fanciful combinations of human, animal, and plant forms discovered at the end of the 15th century. For Renaissance excavators, they named their frescoes Grotesque, right? Not because of their formal characteristics, but because of their location, which they were found in the underground cave-like grottos of the ruins of the palace. So from Renaissance walls and ceilings, the grotesque enjoyed a certain literary metamorphosis in the 16th century, writings of Rabelais and others, which in effect moved it backwards in time to medieval carnival grounds. So Bakhtin's work on Francois Rabelais, texts with folk humor and culture in the Middle Ages, laughter becomes liberative against the oppressive authoritative structures. In Rabelais and his world, Gargantua and Pantagruel are figures of excessive and exaggerated proportions. They exemplify the grotesque body in literature. Grotesque realism is one of the aspects of carnival, which Bakhtin coined for us in this work. Bakhtin's work with Rabelais will be useful for reading Judges 19 through 21 through this literary lens of grotesque realism. Bakhtin's socio-linguistic analysis of Rabelais provides groundwork for identifying the function of obscene materiality in his work. The spirit of carnival is an inversion of sacred and political institutions with folk humor. Grotesque realism is a feature of the carnivalesque that resists a political, theological, cultural hegemony. Subjugated voices are given platform to speak through Bakhtín's literary theory of carnival with medieval genre of folk humor, which highlights this inversion of social roles. Grotesque body imagery is presented within this idea of carnival, and it deals with the lower stratums of the body through wildly fantastic body imagery. Bakhtin writes that the aim is to disunite those things that have been falsely brought together in order to reveal false connections that distort the authentic nature of things, false associations established and reinforced by tradition and sanctioned by religious and official ideology. Rabelais' literary artistic method is illustrated in these following basic categories. The first is the series of the human body, so its anatomical, physiological aspects. The second is the human clothing series. The third is the food series. And then we have drink and drunkenness series, the sexual series, death series, and defecation series. So the human body becomes representative of greater realities, the world, the human race. A grotesque reading of Judges 19 through 21 resists the lighthearted spirit embodied in Bakhtín's folk humor model and embraces the more sinister side of grotesque realism, a neglected aspect in Bakhtín's work. Nevertheless, it's applicable with the exaggerated nature of feasting and hospitalities, violent sexual activity and kidnapping, dismemberment, and finally death and destruction. Some scholars' view of the grotesque suggests that death and life are opposites. But for Bakhtin, death and life are interconnected in the grotesque. This interconnectedness is a regenerating vision and a useful approach to Judges 19 through 21. The absurd representations within the Judges text, namely the grotesque blending of human and animal form, offers one way to read the nuances in the strange and violent representations of the body of the Pelegesh and her sacrificial dismemberment. Judges 19 merges human and animal through sacrificial terms used for the Pelegesh, revealing how with the grotesque, the body of the Pelegesh becomes dehumanized through exaggeration. This next section will take a close look at the body of the Pelegesh and then look at the literary interplay of 19 through 21 with Bakhtín's use of degradation in the grotesque, weaving life into the violent places, spaces, and wombs through the use of female bodies. Fiona Black writes, in short, the grotesque body, as Bakhtin suggests, plays on the cycle of life, but it is not an elevation or romanticizing of nature and life. The linchpin for grotesque realism is the foregrounding of the body in process, ever building and rebuilding itself, reproducing other bodies, sliding always towards its final end of death and decay, where ironically, as food for worms, it propels other wormy bodies through the same movement. Bakhtin describes the unfinished process of the body. The grotesque body is not separated from the rest of the world. It is not closed. It is not a completed unit. It is unfinished, outgrows itself, transgresses its own limits. That is the ever unfinished, ever created body. The unfinished and open body, dying, bringing forth, and being born, is not separated from the world by clearly defined boundaries. It is blended with the world, with animals, with objects. It is cosmic. It represents the entire material body world in all of its elements. It is an incarnation of this world at the absolute lower stratum, as the swallowing up and generating principle, as the bodily grave and bosom, as a field which has been sown, in which new roots are preparing to sprout. A close investigation of the terms used reveals the odd and grotesque nature of the violent portrait of abuse and the method of death for the Pelegesh. After she was abused through the night, she's commanded to get up by the Levite as her hand lay upon the sop, the threshold. The usual term for doorway is not used in this one scene, though it is used twice earlier. The term sop, threshold, is used only once in the entire Judges story. In Exodus, it is used as the basin which holds the ceremonial blood of the lamb that is to be placed on the doorposts. It's a term used for threshold and of a temple and a palace. The ordinary, sacred, and symbolic are all encompassed in this term for threshold. Her moment of death is ambiguous. Sacrifice is a haunting motif, culminating the death of the Pelegesh in Judges 19, who is cut bit by bit by Hamachalet, the knife. The only other knife with the definite article being the one gripped by Abraham at the near sacrifice of Isaac in Genesis 22. The main focus of this next section will be on the manner that she is carved into 12 pieces with the use of the verb natah, to cut. After she is dismembered, the Levite will send her body parts as a violent message for the tribes to assemble. What is of particular interest here is the manner of her dismemberment, which evokes a grotesque portrait of the merging of human and animal with the body of the Pelegesh. The use of natah, to cut, in the Pentateuch, the Deuteronomic history, and in the prophetic text of Ezekiel reveals that its use in Judges is atypical as applied to a woman's body. The intertextual use of natah as a religious political symbol links the Levi's his actions to priestly animal sacrifice. The root natah, to cut, occurs 22 times in the Hebrew Bible in 13 passages. In its verbal form, it is only in the PL. The root is also found in the nominal form in the Judges text. It is only found in 2 places in the verbal form. It's in Judges 19:29 and Judges 26. It is in the verbal form in the context of the woman being dismembered by the Levite, and then later his accounting of it. When observed in a wider scope in the Hebrew Bible, its syntagmatic use results in some very interesting findings. The use of this term generally occurs in a sacrificial, priestly, or prophetic context, including the one parallel passage with Saul in 1 Samuel 11:7. The Hebrew word natah is found within the Pentateuch in Exodus and Leviticus. In Exodus 17, it's in the verbal and nominal form. In the PL verb form, the meaning denotes to cut up, to divide into pieces, divide by the joint. In its use in Exodus, its depiction is that of the consecration of priests. In this verse, it provides instructions for Aaron and his sons on how to prepare the sacrificial ram for burnt offering. In Leviticus, it's in the nominal form, and in every use refers to a burnt offering. The burnt offerings are performed twice daily, including special days such as annual feasts, Sabbath, new moon festivals. It was also performed ritualistically along with a sin offering for the unclean and defiled. In the Deuteronomic history, natah is found in 1 Samuel 11:7. This passage is also a parallel to the Judges story in 19:29 through 30. The actions of the Levite with the Pelegesh mirror the actions of Saul with the oxen. Each employ the verb, he took, he cut up, he sent. The limbs of the slain woman in Judges 19 and the animal in 1 Samuel 11 were a threatening message to incite a quick assembly. If one chose not to assemble, what had been done to the animal would be the fate of the receiver. The oath stipulations were bound up in the cutting. This was not a normative symbolic action in the Hebrew Bible as a way to call for an assembly. The message was clear and is evidence in the Israelites' response that this has not been done since the days of Egypt in Judges 19:30. Other examples in the ancient Near East attest to assembly through body parts of animals, but the use of a woman in Judges is strange. Natah is depicted in Judges and Ezekiel in the nominal form. These are the only 2 places used to describe people. In Judges, it depicts the Pelegesh, and in Ezekiel 24:6, it's used to describe the siege and the inhabitants of Jerusalem, who will be taken out of the boiling pot piece by piece and eventually exiled. The intertextual use of natah reveals a ritualistic and symbolic use in each mashal, proverb, parable, in Judges 19 through 21, but also Ezekiel 24, along with a more cultic use in priestly texts of consecration that also signify ritual sacrifice. The severing of animal or person was intentional, priestly, prophetic, and political message. The appropriation of this term, natah, indicates a broader theological political thrust in a transitional period for Israel before the monarchy and into the exilic period. The horrific and abusive symbolic use of a woman's body terrorizes the reader even more once the actions of how she is cut up is equated to sacrificial animal slaughter. The intertextual use of natah indicates that the use of this term by the text artisan communicates something atypical and bizarre in this graphic depiction. Readers are invited to consider this horrific and traumatic scene of excess. The graphic nature of Judges 19 through 21, the depiction, or 19, 29 through 30, the depiction of a woman being sliced into pieces highlights the grotesque portrait of the message. Given the intertextual connections of natah with such a broad range of priestly and prophetic material, The message sent in her body indicates a dark and violent sense of irony. The grotesque is presented in juxtaposition of these oddities, such as the woman sent as pieces, and then during the assembly, the tribes speak as one voice, which ignites the course of events for the beginning of a civil war and the execution of the ban against the tribe of Benjamin and later Jabesh Gilead. Unity and disunity, dismembered and the collective, all contribute to the grotesque body imagery of a woman and a nation, dead yet unfinished, a body still becoming. The last aspect I want to focus on is the grotesque portrait of women's bodies in Judges 21, with a focus on the wombs of the kidnapped and raped women of Shiloh. With degradation, everything high and ideal is lowered, sinks into the earth. The earth is a womb that also sprouts new life. It is a pregnant death. The women of Shiloh are seized, kidnapped for their wombs. Bakhtin writes, degradation digs a bodily grave for new birth. It is not only destructive, but grotesque realism also knows no other level. It is the fruitful earth and womb. It is always conceiving. Here at the end of Judges, death and life interweave through the execution of the ban on Jabesh Gilead and the need for more wombs for the men of Benjamin. Looking at the whole of Judges 19 through 21, it is a grotesque portrait of Bakhtin's degradation. The Levite destroys a woman's body, her humanity, the potential in her womb, and the women of Shiloh are kidnapped. They are objectified as wombs, raped for new life. Death and life become obscene, excessive, violent. Juxtaposing the images of violence and death with new life becomes an overwhelming representation of degradation. For Bakhtin, a perfect example of this two-bodied image can be found in the Kirch terracotta figurines, the senile, laughing, pregnant women of extremely advanced age. He writes, this is a typical and strongly expressed grotesque. It is ambivalent. It is a pregnant death, a death that gives birth. There is nothing completed, nothing calm and stable. He writes, they combine the senile, decaying, deformed body with the body of new life, conceived but is yet unformed. Life shown here as an ambivalent, internally contradictory process. There is nothing complete. This is unfinalizability in its purest form. In conclusion, one can contend that the exorbitant gendered brutality and the violent the moral assessment in the refrain, Israel had no king, and Israel, everyone did as they saw fit, paints a portrait of a violent and grotesque birth story of a nation. Perhaps it speaks a note of irony, not only on a failed monarchy, but also the priesthood. The book of Samuel details this transition into the monarchy, and ironically begins with the story of a woman in prayer and weeping for a pregnancy, praying at Shiloh. Judges 19 through 21 reveals the dehumanization of women and their bodies through the exaggerated nature of the grotesque, and reflects a phenomenon in transformation as a yet unfinished metamorphosis of death and birth, a story unfinished, and an open-ended epilogue to Judges. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Jenny. And let me now go ahead and bring back in Dr. Kay Higuera-Smith and turn it over to you, Kay.
That was a really fascinating paper, Jenny, and I have a ton of questions. We'll have to have coffee sometime after the pandemic is over and talk about it more. But time does constrain us. So let me ask you this. It seems like one of the most central characteristics of this genre of grotesque realism is that of the carnivalesque humor. Mm-hmm. And of course, that's the one element that's missing. And you acknowledge that, and your argument is that there are so many other elements that one element is the only one missing. However, it seems that one could make the case that the humor, the carnivalesque humor, is central. It's not ancillary. It's a central characteristic. So, how would you respond to that major distinction?
Yeah, and so that's a really good question. And I agree with your comment that humor is essential for this genre. I should have probably drawn out the humor of irony more clearly because it's so pervasive in the Hebrew Bible, and especially Judges 19 through 21. And I guess for this paper, I was trying to distinguish, and I don't know if this will fully answer, but the darker side of irony in Judges with grotesque realism, how the carnivalesque body works with its exaggerated forms. And one of the critiques of Bakhtin was that he did not focus on the darker side of this humor, which other scholars have noticed. Bakhtin did focus on the more liberative and positive side of folk humor, things more entertaining. But with grotesque realism, there is this also darker side of humor that I wish I would have maybe brought out a little bit more in my paper, the more bitter, cynical, and maybe mocking side that fits well with Judges. So I think, like you had mentioned, my hope was not to take away the humor, but to focus on the dark side of it. And I imagine that these texts, as they're maybe compiled and written, maybe almost like having a gallows humor that would arise from the trauma that they had experienced in exile.
Yeah, it seems, I don't know. I mean, I get what you're saying about irony, but I don't know how you could even derive a dark humor from that without more information. But nevertheless, so many other elements are so striking, and especially I think that was striking to me was the priestly elements of the knife, the threshold, and you left out the fact that it was a Levite who was the one who cut her. So that it really gives me insights, and I know as I teach on this passage on this pericope, I'll draw from your insights. Another question I want to ask is this issue of the theme of woman as a sacrifice, because it shows up again in Judges 11 also with Jephthah's daughter. And, you even have this phrase, his only begotten, in verse 34, which obviously uses similar language to Genesis 22:2, where it refers to Abraham and his only begotten Isaac. So that really got me thinking, what are other parallels between these two narratives in Judges, and what is at stake for the narrators of Judges to include both? How do they inform each other? What do they tell us about that narrator's story?
Ooh, that's a really good question, Kay. Yes, I think this theme of women as sacrifice just haunts through all these texts. And as you mentioned, there's this interplay with Judges 19 through 21 and Genesis 22, that binding of Isaac. It's such a thought-provoking connection, and especially with Jephthah's daughter. And I can't help but think of these chapters sort of being maybe written, especially 19 through 21, after the trauma of exile. I wonder about the nature and function of these chapters in these real transitional moments in their story. And I keep thinking of this birth story of a people, of a nation, described in such dark and violent ways. And this is where I think grotesque realism can be a fascinating lens. When I think of Jephthah and Judges 19 through 21, some of the connections I see, there's a rash vow, similar to the oath in Judges. Both stories contain strange oaths and also weeping. I did another paper for SBL kind of focusing on just weeping through Judges. There's almost this crescendo at the end of Judges with a great weeping. And then with the Akedah, the binding of Isaac, there's the grotesque with sacrifice and death. And then later the birth of different nations through Isaac's twins, Jacob and Esau. And perhaps this is like me speculating, but maybe there's a seedbed of hope in these real earthy, dark stories. I imagine them being in exile and wrestling with their thoughts, like what just happened? Can God still be in our story? And then remembering the near sacrifice of Isaac, and yes, there's intervention, he was spared. But on the flip side of wrestling in exile, there's also a real uncertainty. And although Isaac was spared, not everyone is, right? So in the case of Jephthah's daughter and the Pelegesh with the Levite, there's no intervention. There's this interweaving, which I find fascinating, and I think I'm still contemplating, of death and life. And at the end of Judges, there just seems to be this descent into the dark abyss, similar to Jephthah's daughter. And in my other research, I juxtaposed Judges 19 through 21 and the story of Ruth. Ruth's a very different type of birth story, ending with the genealogy of David, right? The monarchy. And there is a violent and dark side to Ruth, but it's also an intimate story full of named women and feminine dialogue, with a similar progenitive problem that we find at the end of Judges. So I see them as these birth stories of a people, wrestling with these questions in exile, like what next, how, right? How these stories, they just end, in my mind, open-ended and unfinalized.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Jenny. Thank you, Kay. And thank all of you who may have tuned in to catch this video. And we hope that by this time next year, maybe we will be gathered in a place for the regional meeting. But until that time, take good care, everyone. And we hope to see you soon.